Two hands move across the face of the Prague astronomical clock in Old Town Square, and they don't move at the same speed. That's a fair enough metaphor for the city underneath it. Prague runs on two economies at once, one priced in koruna, tied to a national wage that just crossed 50,000 crowns a month, and one priced in euros and dollars, carried in by remote workers and digital nomads who never touch a Czech payslip. Same apartments, same grocery stores, same metro, two very different clocks, and by the end of this episode, it should be clear which one is easier to live by. Prague is the capital of the Czech Republic, home to roughly 1.4 million people, and it sits inside the European Union without sitting inside the Eurozone. That single fact does a lot of quiet work in this episode. Prices are set in koruna, but a growing share of the housing market, new build listings especially, is already quoted in euros, aimed squarely at buyers who don't earn koruna at all. Keep that in mind. It comes back. Start with the koruna side of the clock. According to the Czech Statistical Office, the average gross monthly wage across the national economy reached 50,282 koruna in the first quarter of 2026, up 8.1% year-on-year, the ninth straight quarter of real wage growth after inflation. For the full year 2025, the average landed at 49,215 koruna, itself a 7.2% rise on the year before. That's the headline number. It is not, however, the number most people actually take home. The Statistical Office's own data shows that roughly two-thirds of Czech employees earn below that national average. The average is pulled upward by a smaller number of high earners, which is a pattern familiar from almost every wage economy, but worth stating plainly rather than letting the headline figure stand in for what a typical paycheck looks like. Layer in the local scale. The 2025 statutory minimum wage was 20,800 koruna a month. Some industry guides report a further increase to around 22,400 koruna for 2026, though that figure comes from payroll advisory sources rather than a statistical office release we could independently confirm, so treat it as reported rather than settled. Above that, the national average wage, 50,282 koruna. Above that, Prague itself. In the second quarter of 2025, Prague's own average monthly wage hit 62,307 koruna, the highest of any region in the country, and 12,905 koruna above the national figure for that same quarter, with the number of people employed in the city up 2.9% year-on-year to roughly 830,000. For numbers, for rungs, all inside the same currency, all inside the same country. The capital pays more. It also, as the next sections show, charges more for the privilege. Zoom out from wages to overall living costs, and the disagreement between trackers only widens. Numbeo puts Prague's median after-tax salary at $2,366, enough, by its own calculation, to cover only about 1.2 months of the city's living expenses, a tight but positive margin. Livingcost.org's total monthly cost of living figure for a single person is $1,899, ranking Prague 2,377th out of roughly 9,294 cities worldwide, in the top 26% most expensive globally by its methodology. A third tracker, Living Cost Index, puts the same single-person total slightly lower at $1,889 including rent, but pairs it with a considerably higher average salary figure of $2,400. So the same city gets described, depending on which tracker you trust, as costing anywhere from $1,889 to $1,957 a month for a single person, against an average salary variously reported between $2,366 and $2,400. The cost totals cluster reasonably close together. The salary figures used to judge them do not always match the wage data from the Czech Statistical Office cited above. A reminder that international cost trackers and national statistical offices aren't always measuring the same population the same way. Now the other side of the clock, renting in Prague as a local salary earner. Multiple cost of living trackers converge on a rough shape here, but disagree sharply on the details. and that disagreement is itself worth reporting rather than smoothing over. City cost puts a one-bedroom in the city center at $1,134 a month, dropping to $892 outside it, and calculates that housing eats roughly 47% of its cited average net salary of $2,391. World cost of living, working from different inputs, puts the same city center one-bedroom at $1,260, but has the outside center version dropping much further, to $630, and pegs its average after-tax salary at only $1,625, from which rent consumes a steeper 58%. Those two burden percentages, 47 and 58, are not simply two estimates of the same fact. They rest on two different salary baselines to begin with, $2,391 versus $1,625, so the ratios cannot be compared directly even though both are labeled rent burden. A third source, the expat-focused calculator of Fordware, cites what it describes as official government housing statistics and lands on a much wider band, 16,800 to 36,000 koruna a month for a one-bedroom, depending on neighborhood, roughly $700 to $1,530 at current exchange rates. That range is wide enough to swallow both of the other trackers' city center figures whole. None of these three sources is obviously wrong. They're measuring different things, different neighborhood mixes, different points in the rental cycle, different definitions of average. What they agree on, underneath the noise, is the direction. Rent in central Prague now runs at or above what a below-average local earner takes home in a month, and even at the low end of the ranges, it claims a share of income well past the conventional 30% affordability line. Spend any time in Prague relocation forums, and a recurring exchange shows up in different words each time. Someone posts a job offer, states the gross koruna figure, and asks whether it's enough to live on comfortably as a single person. The answers vary by lifestyle and neighborhood, but they consistently orbit the same rough zone, the numbers above point to. Offers in the high 30,000s to 40,000s koruna net tend to draw cautious, workable, but tight if you want to live centrally responses, while offers approaching or exceeding 60,000 koruna net draw more confident ones. It's an unscientific poll, but it lines up with the wage data closely enough to be worth mentioning. The national statistics and the anecdotal chatter are, roughly, describing the same city. Now flip to the other economy occupying the exact same buildings. A remote worker or digital nomad renting that identical one-bedroom isn't measuring it against a Czech payslip. They're measuring it against a US, UK, or EU 15 salary paid in a stronger currency, deposited somewhere else entirely. World Cost of Living's own Digital Nomad budget line puts a comfortable monthly total. Housing, food, co-working, the rest, at $1,883, of which co-living style housing takes about $810, or 43%. An expat professional wanting a fully central lease and a more conventional lifestyle should plan for around $2,425 a month. Compare that to the local side. A Prague resident earning the city's own average wage of 62,307 koruna, roughly $2,850 gross before tax, is competing for the same listings against people whose entire monthly budget looks similar to that gross figure, but who face no Czech income tax, no Czech social contributions, and no ceiling tied to a Czech pay scale. Short-term flexibility widens that gap further. One tracker puts a monthly Airbnb-style stay in Prague at around $1,620, 29% more than a long-term central lease, while purpose-built co-living spaces, aimed squarely at the nomad economy, average $810 a month and bundle in utilities and a ready-made community. Neither option exists in any meaningful way for the local salary earner who is renting on a 1- or 2-year contract, paying separate utility bills, and building no equivalent network of fellow arrivals. The rental market isn't just split by price. It's split by product. The hard currency economy gets a menu of flexible, service-bundled options the koruna economy mostly doesn't. Groceries and daily food costs split along a gentler version of the same line. City cost prices monthly groceries for one person at around $274, with a mid-range restaurant dinner for two running $46, well under the roughly $75 European average it cites for comparison. For a local earner, that's a manageable slice of a monthly income in the tens of thousands of koruna. For a remote worker whose budget was mentally built around US or Western European grocery prices, the same basket often reads as one of the more pleasant surprises of moving to Prague, a rare line item where the hard currency economy comes out clearly ahead rather than merely even. Utilities tell a smaller but still real version of the story. Wise puts basic monthly utilities, electricity, heating, cooling, water, and garbage, for an 85 square meter apartment at around 257 British pounds. A fixed cost that lands very differently on a tenant paying it out of a 50,282 koruna salary than on one paying it out of a budget several times that size in relative terms. Buying, rather than renting, is where the gap turns structural instead of just uncomfortable. Investropa, working from the Deloitte Real Index of closed transactions cross-referenced against CBRE and Engel and Volker's market reports, puts the median Prague apartment at 8.1 million koruna, about $393,000, as of early 2026, with the citywide average pulled up to 9.4 million koruna by luxury sales. That's transaction-based data, what people actually paid, after negotiation, to close a sale. Set beside it, average household income in the Czech Republic runs somewhere around 31,000 to 33,000 euros a year gross, per the same reporting. Run the arithmetic, and an apartment now costs roughly 10 times an average household's annual gross income, well outside the 3 to 5 times range that's typically treated as sustainable for mortgage lending. A second, entirely legitimate way of measuring the same market gives a different answer, and the gap between the two is worth naming rather than resolving in favor of one. Realting.com, drawing on joint analytics from developers Central Group, Skanska, and Trigema, reports new-build apartment sales in Prague running about 8% higher in 2025 than in 2024, with available supply down roughly 10% and prices at in asking terms, around 7,200 euros per square meter on the primary market, which for a typical 60 to 70 square meter unit works out to roughly 470,000 euros total. That's an asking price figure on new construction specifically, a narrower, pricier slice of the market than the closed transaction median across the whole city. The two figures aren't contradicting each other so much as measuring different markets that happen to share a currency and a postcode. One is what changed hands citywide. The other is what a developer is asking for a brand new unit. The 8.1 million koruna median isn't where Prague started, and the climb is worth putting a number on. By Investropa's accounting, Prague apartment prices have risen roughly 150% over the past decade in nominal terms. Adjusted for inflation, the real gain narrows to somewhere between 80 and 95%, still close to a doubling of purchasing power required, even after stripping out currency effects. New construction compounds the gap further. As of June 2026, new-build apartments in Prague typically cost 18 to 25% more than comparable resale units, and separately, new apartments nationwide run at roughly twice the blended national price per square meter. A local buyer isn't just competing against yesterday's prices. They're competing against a market that has spent 10 years moving faster than wages and a new-build segment moving faster still. Break the ownership ladder down by unit size, and the numbers escalate in a way worth sitting with. A small studio, 28 to 35 square meters, runs 4.2 to 6 million koruna at the entry to mid-tier, climbing above 6.5 million for a high-end version in Vinohrady, Karlin, Letna, or Old Town. A one-bedroom, the standard unit this whole episode keeps returning to, averages around 7.3 million koruna as of June 2026, about $349,000 or 302,000 euros. A three-bedroom family apartment, 85 to 90 square meters, starts around 11.5 million koruna at the entry to mid-tier and runs to 15.5 million, with luxury versions in Vinohrady, Digvice, Bubanek, or Podily clearing 18 million. Studio, 1 bedroom, 3 bedroom, 4 to 6 million, 7.3 million, 11.5 to 18 million. Each step up in space is a step up in price that a national average salary of 50,282 koruna a month was never built to absorb. Geography inside the city does some of the same work that unit size does. Prague 1 and Prague 2, the historic core and Vinohrady, run 204,000 to 437,000 koruna per square meter. Prague 13 and Prague 17, outer residential districts on the metro's far edges, run 97,000 to 133,000 koruna per square meter, roughly a third to half the price for a longer commute. One side of the city, the other side of the city, same public transport network connecting both, same currency, a price difference of 2 to 4 times depending on which end of the line you're willing to live on. Mortgage financing adds one more layer of disagreement worth flagging quickly rather than glossing over. One tracker citing Numbeo-style survey data puts the current annual mortgage interest rate at 5.9%. Investropa, citing Czech National Bank analysis, describes rates having dropped to around 4.6% by late 2025, down from over 5.3% in 2023. These aren't necessarily contradictory. They may simply be snapshots from slightly different months in a rate environment that's been moving. But a buyer comparing two sources casually could reasonably end up with two different monthly payment estimates for the exact same loan size. Layered onto that, the Czech National Bank's stricter rules on investment property mortgages take effect in April 2026, tightening credit specifically for buy-to-let purchases rather than owner-occupied homes. A distinction that matters in a market shaped as much by investor demand as by resident demand. Transportation is where this episode's usual pattern breaks, and it's worth pointing out precisely because it's the exception. Prague's Public Transit Authority, DPP, together with the regional PID network, restructured its tariff zones from 4 down to 3 as of January 1, 2026. Softening cross-border fare increases even as paper ticket prices rose roughly 30% and app-based prices rose about 20% elsewhere in the system. Inside Prague itself, the core fares held steady. A 30-minute ticket costs 39 koruna on paper or 36 in the Letaka app, a 90-minute ticket 50 or 46 koruna, a 24-hour ticket 150 or 140 koruna, and a 72-hour ticket 350 or 340 koruna. Ride without a valid ticket, and the on-the-spot fine is 1,200 koruna. For residents, the season passes are where the two economies briefly converge instead of diverge. A 30-day non-transferable pass costs 550 koruna. A 90-day pass costs 1,480 koruna. A full annual pass costs 3,650 koruna, working out to less than 310 koruna a month, unlimited, across the entire metro, tram, bus, trolleybus, and ferry network. Set that against the wage ladder from earlier. For someone earning the national average of 50,282 koruna, an annual pass amounts to roughly 0.6% of 1 month's gross salary. For a remote worker whose monthly budget runs in the $1,600 to $2,400 range, that same 310 koruna a month, around $13 to $14, is functionally a rounding error. Rent diverges sharply between the two economies. Transit, for once, barely moves the needle for either one. Healthcare is where the two economies split again, and this time the split is structural rather than incidental. It's built into who is and isn't allowed to join the same system. Czech public health insurance is funded through payroll contributions of 13.5% of salary, split between employer and employee, administered across 7 public insurers, the largest of which, VZP, covers roughly 60% of the population. An employed foreigner working for a Czech employer joins that same public system on the same terms as a Czech citizen. Full access to GPs, specialists, hospitals, prescriptions, and maternity care with low co-payments. A remote worker or freelance digital nomad, by contrast, is generally locked out of that public system entirely because eligibility runs through employment with a Czech-registered employer, not through simple residence. Non-EU nationals on long-term visas over 90 days are required to hold comprehensive commercial insurance instead, typically through PVZP, the commercial subsidiary of VZP, or providers like Maxima and Slavia. Policies that one pricing guide puts at starting around 900 koruna a month for basic emergency-only cover and 1,700 koruna a month for comprehensive coverage, or in annualized terms, roughly 7,000 to 13,000 koruna a year for a comprehensive student-style policy. EU and EEA citizens sit in a middle position. The European Health Insurance Card grants access to Czech public facilities on the same terms as citizens for stays under 90 days, though it covers necessary and urgent care rather than the full scope a resident gets. For Czechs who work for themselves rather than an employer, the self-employed, or OSV, the public system still applies, but at its own minimum floor. VZP's own published rates list minimum monthly premiums for self-payers ranging from 2,188 to 3,306 koruna, depending on category, a fixed cost that lands the same way on a low-earning freelancer as on a high-earning one, since it isn't scaled to income the way payroll contributions are. That's a structural asymmetry worth sitting with. A Czech employee's healthcare cost scales with their paycheck. A Czech freelancers and a foreign nomads, in different ways, do not. Residency status is what determines almost everything above it, so it's worth closing on the rules that decide who gets to play which economy in the first place. EU, EEA, Swiss, and UK citizens need no visa at all. Free movement lets them live and work in Czechia indefinitely. The practical requirement is a formality rather than an obstacle. Register a stay exceeding 90 days with the foreign police, provide proof of accommodation and either employment or sufficient funds, and the process carries a modest administrative fee rather than anything resembling an income threshold. It's the simplest of the paths this episode covers. Free movement first, paperwork second. Everyone else works through the Ministry of the Interior's long-term visa and residence permit system. And that's where the Digital Nomad Path enters the picture. Czechia's Digital Nomad Program, launched July 1, 2023 under Government Decree 475/2023, doesn't create a standalone visa category. It fast-tracks the existing long-term business purpose visa for a narrow group. Remote IT professionals initially, expanded in 2025 to include marketing specialists and 4 additional eligible nationalities: Brazil, Israel, Mexico, and Singapore. It's worth correcting a claim that circulates in visa guides. The program is not a single 3-year grant. It's issued as an initial long-term visa of up to 1 year, then extended through a separate long-term residence permit for up to 2 further years. A multi-year stay built incrementally through renewal, not handed over all at once. The income bar sits at 1.5 times the Czech average salary, roughly 69,836 koruna a month in 2026, a threshold that moves as the national average moves, since it's pegged to that same wage figure from the opening of this episode. On top of income proof, applicants need comprehensive private health insurance of the kind described earlier, a registered trade license, 1,000 koruna a year, and an application filed at a Czech embassy abroad, not from inside the country. A permanent residency card, for those who eventually qualify, costs 2,500 koruna. Compare that income bar, 69,836 koruna, against the numbers from the start of the episode. It's roughly 39% above Prague's own average wage of 62,307 koruna, and nearly 1.4 times the national average. The Digital Nomad Path, in other words, is explicitly designed to admit only people already earning more than most Czechs who live and work in Prague itself. The Digital Nomad Program isn't the only route in for people outside its IT and marketing eligibility list. A longer-standing, nationality-broader alternative runs through the same trade license, Zivnostensky list, used by the Nomad Program, but as a standard business residence permit rather than a fast-tracked one. Freelancers and self-employed remote workers who don't qualify for the Nomad Program's restricted professions or nationality list can, in principle, register as OSV and apply for residence on business grounds through the ordinary long-term visa process. It's slower, carries none of the Nomad Program's streamlined marketing, and comes with the same 1,000 koruna annual trade license fee, but it's open to a wider range of professions and passports than the headline-grabbing digital nomad visa that gets most of the attention in relocation guides. Put a single month on paper for each side, and the abstraction turns concrete. The local side, gross salary at the national average, 50,282 koruna. Rent for a modest one-bedroom outside the center, somewhere in the 16,800 to 27,000 koruna band, depending on which tracker's methodology is closer to a given neighborhood. A transit pass at roughly 310 koruna. Groceries in the low thousands of koruna. If self-employed rather than salaried, a healthcare floor starting around 2,188 koruna, regardless of how thin the month has been. Layer housing, healthcare, and transit onto that salary, and there is a real but narrow margin left over, which is exactly what Numbio's 1.2 months of expenses calculation was describing. The Nomad side, same month, different denomination, a budget in the 1,883 to 2 for $25 range depending on lifestyle, of which co-living or a central one-bedroom takes 43 to over 50%. The identical 310 koruna transit pass, now a rounding error rather than a line item. Groceries running comfortably under whatever that budget assumed back home. And a private comprehensive health policy starting around 1,700 koruna a month, a fixed cost with no relationship to Czech payroll tax at all. Both months end with money left over. The koruna month ends with a narrow margin measured against a wage ceiling. The hard currency month ends with a wide margin measured against a budget that was already generous by local standards before the first koruna was spent. Step back and look at the whole clock face. A local earner in Prague clears an average of 62,307 koruna a month, hands over roughly half of it to rent if they want to live centrally, pays into a healthcare system scaled to their paycheck, and travels the entire city for less than 310 koruna a month. A foreign remote worker or approved digital nomad enters the same rental listings with a budget benchmark to a stronger currency, is legally barred from the public health care the local pays into, buys private cover instead, and had to clear an income bar 39% above what the average Prague resident earns just to get in the door. Both hands are moving. They are not telling the same time. And every pillar in this episode, from rent to healthcare to the visa paperwork itself, is built around keeping it that way. It's worth placing Prague against the two cities this series covered just before it. Porto and Lisbon were built around a myth-Czech premise. The idea that a city's old, cheap reputation had quietly expired while nobody updated the narrative. Prague's story is closer to the opposite problem. It was never marketed as cheap in the first place, not for over a decade. Yet the gap between what it pays locals and what it demands from newcomers has kept widening anyway. A city doesn't need a myth to debunk if the two-tier structure was built into its housing and visa systems from the start. One more number worth adding before the numbers stop. The cost of simply visiting to scope the city out before committing to either economy. A cheap one-star hotel in Prague runs around $27 a night, a hostel bed about $29, a mid-range three-star room about $100, and a four-star closer to $172, a wide enough range that a scouting trip can be built at almost any budget. That's a small detail next to koruna salaries and million koruna apartments, but it's the one number in this episode that applies equally to everyone reading it, local or foreign, before any decision about which clock to live by has actually been made. So which clock is Prague actually running on? The one that pays its own citizens, or the one built to admit people who already out-earn them? And if you're the one deciding which economy to enter, is the question really whether Prague is affordable or whether it was ever meant to be affordable for you specifically?